Chapter 9. The Gods as Dwelling in the Physiological Centers. I indicated in the last chapter how the form and figure of the actual king may rise into that of a god through its blending with the immense subconscious emotion of the race. So of other gods and divinities. The idealization of the warrior, growing through successive generations obscurely but powerfully in the primitive Latin folk, suddenly, perhaps through the appearance of an actual man who fulfilled the ideal to an extraordinary degree, may have taken definite shape and name in the figure of Mars, who thenceforth, identified with the ideal, stood as the god of war for succeeding time. Or the enthusiasm for the athlete or strongman, so deeply rooted in primitive peoples, may have been brought to a focus by the appearance of a real Heracles or Hercules. The names and figures, then, of these men became for after generations the center of this enthusiasm and deep racial instinct of admiration, and to these names were ascribed many exploits, not only of these, but of other heroes, before and after. And since in any such cases of mighty men appearing among a people, the exploits which would produce the most profound impression would be those which were most beneficial to the folk, the slaying of monsters and wild beasts, the cleansing of pestilent swamps, the taming of oxen, the wrestling with death, and so forth. So it would be these which would be enshrined in the public memory, and which, from various sources, would cluster round the ideal figure of the hero or savior. This myth-making tendency of races, and the unconscious clustering of incidents and anecdotes from various sources round one or more definite figures, is of course well recognized, and explains how it is these legends often seem to contain so deep a sentiment and meaning. It is that they are the selection and affectionate preservation from the memorial life of the race of events and stories, which illustrate and symbolize some deep instinct and enthusiasm of the race. Such stories being gradually and unconsciously modified into more and more of expressiveness as time goes on. In this way, many great epic poems, legends, myths, and traditions of the gods have been built up, and such things have inevitably a profound sentiment in them. They are wiser than any one man could make them, for they represent the feelings, the enthusiasms, the wonderments, the humor, the wit, the activities to which the race has responded for generations. If such legends and stories were merely mental ideas, if they were such handy little allegories and generalizations as any philosopher or literary person might make in his study, they would be very cheap and paltry affairs. The whole point of the argument will be missed unless it is seen that the ideas and enthusiasms which produce myths and legends lie deep down in the very structure and physical organization of humanity, and in its very physiology, that they are things of age-long life and importance, principalities and powers, if we may so call them, which in the form of these legends and figures are slowly rising into recognition, but which belong to another order of existence, so to speak, than that which we are usually concerned. Here is another god, Mercury, to whom among the Greeks Hermes corresponds, and who is represented also among other nations, the swift runner, messenger god. It seems a little curious at first that a mere messenger ideal should be deified. Where did the glow or glamour which transformed him come from? But when you consider what the swift runner really represented in those days, when you think for a moment what the postal service, the telegraph, the locomotive, and all the other means of intercommunication are to us, when you think of the story of Pheidippides mentioned above, a people in its agony sending their fleetest foot racer to the neighboring state for help, and of the profound sensation, the tears of joy, the enthusiasm, the worship, with which he would be greeted on his return, then it is easy to see that round the figure of the messenger, generally in the national consciousness, a glamour would grow, which would easily transform such figure into a god. And as swift communication means many things besides the delivery of messages, as it means the growth of commerce, the coming into contact with strange peoples and languages and so forth, so the messenger god Hermes, or Mercury, or Thoth, or whoever he may be, would not only be the deliverer of divine messages, but would stand for the patron of all interpretations, mysteries, travel, and commerce, and so even of thieving. The goddess of love and of feminine grace and beauty, Aphrodite, Venus, Freya, Astarte, is one to whom we have already referred. Her temples and worship have been honored among almost all races. We need not go again over ground which we have already partly covered. That there is among the nerves of the human body, of the brain, and of the great sympathetic system, some kind of center or plexus, or group of plexuses, which coordinates and dominates the love instinct, and that this is one of the most powerful and important centers in the body, that connected and associated with this center and its ramifications is a whole world of emotions, desires, mental images, thoughts, activities, and that this center, in both its physical and mental aspects, is the result and growth and embodiment of centuries and ages of race experience. These are things that few will deny. And that the successive images of feminine form and feature, acting on this center and long hereditary line, may have combined to one powerful joint impression, which, even though latent in consciousness, dominates and moves all the race memories of love, is something which seems at least very probable. The raising of this composite, this luminous ghost into consciousness, in the history of a race, is in this view the creation or birth of the goddess of love for that race. Love itself existed from immemorial time, but when into it a deeper consciousness began to come, it was filled with strange force and fire, an extraordinary glow and glamour, and a vague sense of divinity, and of a life beyond the moment. And when, beyond that, the race consciousness itself, in some moment of inspiration, awoke, bringing the astounding revelation of its own memory, like a fairy mountain peak rising over the world, then the individual beheld the veritable goddess, and divined that love was immortal. It will perhaps be said that though this way of looking at the matter may account for those gods which are idealizations of human types, it does not explain why the mere things of nature, like the moon and the sun, or the darkness and the dawn, should be personified. But the least thought shows that the anthropomorphic tendency is in some degree inevitable in us. The moon and the sun are to us what they are, only because they have appeared in human consciousness. Consider for a moment the latter. How many millions of times has the great sun risen on our primitive ancestors, after the dark and perilous night, with unspeakable sense of joy, relief, comfort? How continually has this sense grown with reverberant intensity in the successive generations, till at last, in some more than usually subtle or sensitive soul, it has broken into a strange consciousness of a presence, the presence, in fact, within that soul, of the myriad life and emotion of those that have gone before. The rising orb, the growing glory of the sky, have wakened a multitudinous memory, the memory and consciousness of mankind itself in its most adventurous and buoyant mood. And to this child of man, this primitive poet, the sun has indeed appeared as not only a circle of light in the sky, but as the symbol and reminiscent vision of a majestic and celestial being, going forth to his daily conquest of the world, hero of 1,000 battles, and with the magic upon him of a life immortal. Or, similarly, how often has night descended, with a mystic sense of human terror, doubt, and awe, 1,000,000 times distilled and concentrated. Or seriously, can we even moderns, in tall hat and patent leather boots, regard the young moon in the clear sky of evening without a most foolish yet poignant tenderness and romance, and a sense as if within us and through our eyes, sheer myriads of other eyes were watching her. In all these cases there is a personification truly, but it is because what we are really coming into touch with is not the so-called moon or sun, or darkness or dawn, so much as the great subconscious mind of the race, under its different aspects. It is in this immense world which comes down to us from the far past, that city of 1,000 gates of which we in our individual bodies are but the portals, and yet into which, through our bodies, we have entrance, that we must look for the gods, and for all the evidence of a life which, though greater than that we commonly call our own, belongs to us, and is indeed ours. And here we come again to the point which is the main subject of this chapter, the connection of it with physiology. All those deities I have mentioned, the gods and goddesses of day and night, the gods of war and love, the hero god or savior, the king god or lord of heaven, and many more, represent very distinct centers and coordinations of feeling and activities in the race. But they also, as we have hinted, represent very distinct centers of organic life in each human body, which is indeed an epitome of the race. They represent such physiological centers as love, pugnacity, sympathy, sleep, and so forth. The gods, in fact, may be said not only to be aspects of the life of the race, but to dwell in some sense in the organic nuclei and plexuses of the body, and to be the centers of command and service there. Strange as this may sound, it is yet most important, and the appreciation of this point gives perhaps, more than anything else, the key to the understanding of the religions of paganism and the past, and to the progress of humanity in the future. The body is not vile. It is not only a temple of God, but it is a collection of temples. And just as the images of the gods dwell in the temples of a land, and are the objects of service and the centers of command there, so we may say the gods themselves dwell in the centers and sacred places of the body. The one thing is an allegory or symbol of the other, and it has been the instinct of primitive humanity to express itself in this way. Every organ and center of the body is the seat of some great emotion, which in its proper activity and due proportion is truly divine. It is through this bodily and physiological center that the emotion, the enthusiasm, that portion of the divine being expresses itself, and in the pure and perfect body that expression, that activity, is itself a revelation. The total physiology of man is, or should be, the nearest expression of divinity complete, and the replica or image of the physiology of the cosmos itself. Once this conception of the relation of the human body, not only to the life of the race, but to the whole world of the emotions and inner life of man, and to the panorama of his gods, is fairly seized and appropriated, many things become clear, and as we go on doubtless the whole subject will become clearer. At present, however, we must pass to two other points which need consideration. In the first place, these great formative forces, ideas, enthusiasms, which manifest themselves in the race life, and clothed with emotion dwell in the hidden centers of the actual body, are, from the nature of the case, things which we only become directly conscious of in those moments of excitement or exaltation, which take us into the deeper regions of our being. Though they may be vaguely felt by the ordinary consciousness, they cannot very well be described in its terms. They are, therefore, only seen and seized in their fullness by the few whose more harmonious natures fit them for the vision, or, if by the many, only in rare moments. And so it becomes the function of the inspired prophets, poets, artists, to give these a definite form and name, as Moses did, who bodied forth Jehovah for the Jews, or as Phidias the sculptor is said to have finally fixed and shapen the ideal of Athena for the Athenians. The many, when they see these forms bodied forth by the great seers, leap to them and accept them, feeling distinctly enough that they answer to something which is slumbering within them, though they cannot quite seize the latter directly. The actual figures of the gods, in fact, accepted and adopted by the various races, cannot be said to be realities, but are rather symbols or representations, adopted to the ordinary consciousness, of real powers working in the race and profoundly moving and inspiring it. In the second place, these real powers, ruling in our nerve centers as the image gods rule in the temples, are themselves, of course, always growing. That is to say, that as the race grows and branches, their forms also modify and change, slowly indeed, through centuries, but steadily. But as the images, the once inspired forms which were embodied in stone or paintings, or in holy books and ceremonials, as these do not change, so in time they cease to correspond to the realities. They cease to be inspired or to awaken inspiration, and become dry and dead conventions. On this subject, however, of conventions as affecting the gods, I will say no more here. It leads to the consideration of the change in religious forms and divinities, which takes place as time and history go on, and the eternal conflict between letter and spirit. Returning now to the general line of thought, I would say a few words on the subject of Christianity. In speaking of the genesis of the deities hitherto, I have dwelt more especially on the pagan gods of Greece and Rome. The appearance of Christianity on the scene marked a new growth, not exactly a new growth in the history of the world, because something much, though not quite the same, had appeared long before in India and Egypt, but new in the West. There was growing, in the races which gathered round imperial Rome, a sense, partly due perhaps to the reaction from the life of the day, a sense of the presence of death, a longing for some other life, a belief in the power of gentleness, meekness, chastity, things which had been comparatively little considered by the preceding nature religions. It surely might almost be said that a new center of organic life was forming, a new plexus among the nerves of humanity. No one can visit India without being struck by what seems quite a physiological difference between the average Hindu and the average Westerner. The passivity of the former, the mildness, the meekness, the meditative transcendental temper, the sense of another world, the little fear of death. His organism seems to be differently keyed from ours, so that while the Anglo-Saxon masses are shouting themselves hoarse over a football hero or other athlete, the Hindu peasant is paying his profoundest adoration to an emaciate saint. That is to say, there seems to be some organic center in each race, so much more developed than in the other, that it may be woken to delirium or frenzy, or ecstasy, by a spectacle which leaves the other unmoved. I say some such changes in the organic constitution of humanity were taking place in the Roman Empire, and that quite independently of the little band of propagandists who called themselves Christians. Under Marcus Aurelius, a wider sense of humanity was growing up. Hospitals, orphan schools, hospitals for animals even, began to be founded. Oriental ideas and religions, and, perhaps more important still, Oriental blood and heredity began to circulate. A new type of human being demanded new gods, and men and women whose hearts began to respond to the power of gentleness, the pity of life, the presence of death, who as slaves or the descendants of slaves knew well what it was to be despised and rejected, began to see a glamour in figures of a different complexion from those which had dominated their predecessors. Thus at great length the personality and life of Jesus of Nazareth, or at least the picture of it drawn by Paul and the evangelists, gave form and outline to this new creative idea, and it took the shape of the gentle, loving, and crucified Christ, the God that above all has dominated the Christian centuries. Not that this ideal was, as I have said, absolutely new, for the glamour of it, or of something very similar, allowing for difference of race and longitude, had been embodied 6 centuries before in the figure of the divine Buddha, and doubtless for centuries in the human race, these feelings had been registered in race memory, and had struggled for expression. But new as a recognized ideal, this undoubtedly was in the history of the Western world. And, what I wish to enforce, this figure of Christ written about, pictured in canvas or in stone, or in words of living eloquence, through all these later centuries, has served to waken in the human mind the consciousness of a very real presence. A presence at least as real as that indicated by Apollo or Athena to a Homeric Greek. A definite individualized power which has established itself living and moving in the Western races, and therefore also in each man or woman of these races. In this particular case, we have the advantage of being able to analyze an actual and still operative conception of a God, and I take it that the intense reality, which this figure carries with it to many people, means a great deal. It means that the figure not merely represents a mental ideal of desirable qualities, or the remembrance of a certain beneficent man who once lived, but that it represents a living focus of life in the European peoples of the last 2,000 years, which has slowly emerged to consciousness through the accumulated race memories of a far longer period than that. And I take it that the inward vision of this living power and the presence has in some degree come to most people who have been Christians in anything more than name, while to some people it has come with such force and intensity that they have been persuaded that they beheld the veritable Christ himself, surrounded with glory, or seen in the luminous field of a superior consciousness. At any rate, to deny or utterly discredit all the stories of the saints, from St. Paul, who saw a great light and heard a voice, onward through endless cases to modern times, would be, as I have already suggested, a parochial and purblind view to take. In the same way, I think it seems very unscientific to regard the common stories of conversion as mere fancies or fabrications. It is pretty clear that they represent a reality, a very real experience to those concerned, and though the conversions may not be as luminous or profound as that of St. Paul, it seems to me that they are things of the same kind, cases, namely, in which after long and silent preparation, new centers of life are suddenly disclosed within folk, accompanied by more or less of excitement, vision, and a complete change of outlook on the world. And the stories, often fantastical enough, which accompany such conversions, must be looked on simply as the lame effort of uncultured minds to picture and interpret the cosmic facts experienced. On the other hand, if we regard the vision of Christ, as it comes to many people even nowadays, as indicating a real power and presence, living and working within them, so we must, of course, regard the vision of Athena or Apollo, or of any other god that came to men and women of old, as indicating a very real and living power within them. These are names which humanity through the ages has given to its own powers and faculties, and every individual, as far as he has truly revered and identified himself with the God that moved within him, has so far identified himself with the life of humanity. If we were to go to India, we should find this appearance and presence of the gods everywhere acknowledged and believed in. The vision of Siva, or Vishnu, or Brahma, or of Kali, or Krishna, or any one of the many popular saints who, having once been men, are now become divinities, is common enough. I may give one instance which will help to remove the matter from the region of mere vulgar fantasy and superstition. Among the gnanis and teachers, or gurus, who carry on the tradition of the ancient wisdom religion from very remote times, and some of whom are among the most emancipated, keen-minded, and inspired of human beings, it is said that a pupil, or chela, after all instruction by the guru, may spend a long time before his initiation is quite complete. Then, in the ripeness of time and of his growth, one day or night, the god, or Siva, awful and glorious in light, will appear to him clothed in the form of his guru, and the chela, overcome with amazement and emotion, will leap up, and seeking out his teacher will throw himself, in a flood of tears and of gratitude, at his feet. After which his initiation is fulfilled, and he is received into the long line of those who are followers of the god. Cases of this kind I have personally heard of. The reader also will remember the quotation from Dr. Buck in Chapter 8, and there is no reason, I think, to doubt that the above is at least a fair account of what usually happens in Indian initiations. If so, it illustrates remarkably what has been said all through, namely, that when the vision in the supernal consciousness, with its accompanying blaze of splendor, takes place, it clothes itself generally in the shape of some figure, which is known to the ordinary consciousness, and which is, as it were, the best representation it can get for the purposes of the latter consciousness. There are other figures connected with Christianity on which I can only dwell briefly. The rise of the Virgin Mary or Madonna into a goddess, with her special services and temples, is a mark of change similar to the rise of Christ himself, though perhaps not so pronounced. The Madonna links on very closely to Isis, Demeter, Ceres, the ever-virgin, yet ever-fertile goddesses of the elder world. Yet her motherhood has more of a human feeling in it, and less of a nature symbolism than theirs. And her worship marks perhaps a growth in humanity, of filial worship and respect for woman. When one thinks for a moment of what the mother is to every human being, of the profound impression her figure makes upon the child, and then considers how long, what numberless times, in the history of mankind and in the heredity of every individual, that impression has been repeated on the sensitive film of consciousness, then one sees it as inevitable that there must come a time when the mother figure should be deified, and become surrounded with this halo of race memory. That a mother god should arise, corresponding to the father god of patriarchal times. Indeed, there is much evidence to show that the mother god is the more primitive of the two. As to the Virgin Mother of Christianity, it is said that Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was much devoted to her. Quote, his health was extremely feeble, and once when he was employed in writing his homilies, and was so ill that he could scarcely hold the pen, she graciously appeared to him, and comforted and restored him by her divine presence. And the number of similar records of visions of the Madonna must run into hundreds, if not thousands. Whatever we think about these records, their mere existence convinces us how deep, how much deeper than just one individual life, the figure of the pure, long-suffering, tender, divine mother has etched itself into the heart of the race. But the rise of woman and her influence brought another result with it, the deification of the babe. It is not likely that man, the human male, left to himself would have done this, though it appears that the Fanti on the west coast of Africa have a curious worship of an immortal child. But to woman it was natural. What woman today bending over her sleeping infant has not at some time been aware of a divine child, which seemed to come and blend its features with those she gazed on? The long heredity of mother love and memory is there, and it is not only the little thing before her which she sees, but the long and wondrous dream of the past which its image awakens. This glamour of the child arising primarily in the woman transmitted itself, of course, to the man, transmitted itself to the race generally, and becomes symbolized in such figures as the infant Jesus, the child Horus, and the holy Bambino at Rome, and so forth, giving perhaps a tenderness and humanity to Christianity, which we miss in the earlier religions. Thus the Holy Family, father, mother, and child, consolidated itself. For indeed, the family, in this close and limited form, was a peculiar characteristic of the Egyptian and of the Christian centuries. And human life, the human organism, was establishing itself round this, as one of its most important centers. In the earlier and more primitive and communistic phases of society, the tribe, the gens, the clan, the demos, were the important groups. The family, in the modern sense, was weak. But with the rise of the property civilization and the breakdown of the older societies, the individual ceased to find his life and well-being in the tribe or community, and took refuge, as it were, in the lesser family, which became sacred and all-important to him, as the ark of his better self, and affections amid the troubled waters of external strife and competition. Thus the family gathered sacredness through the centuries till it became deified in the medieval eye. Looking back then at what has been said, we seem to see the gods arising as humanity's consciousness through the ages of its own life and faculties, called into play, no doubt, through contact with nature. Each race representing some aspect of the great world self, and inspired and molded from within by the formative ideas belonging to it, becomes conscious of these creative powers as the gods. The gods are, in that sense, real emanations and expressions of the world self. And again, each individual of the race, affiliated to the race and the gods from whence he springs, or at least to whom he owes his body and his heredity, does through that body and that heredity at times enter into the race consciousness, and become aware of these powers working within him and the race. Each unit mind is an offshoot of the racial mind, each unit body an offshoot of the racial body, and as far as, for each individual, his mind and body register the life and memory of the race, do they form a gate of access to its particular Olympus and group of divinities. In this view, Plato's heaven of eternal changeless forms and essences might be compared to the great uplifted consciousness of the human race. In the latter, forms are seen in the inner light, which certainly to the momentary individual apprehension seems eternal, unchangeable, centers of immense life and activity, mountainous in grandeur, though possibly, like the mountains, really in slow flux and change. Great gods who on their inner side are wisdom and justice, and beauty and courage and mother love, and so forth, in essence the same in all races and peoples, but on their outer side, and with respect to the circumstances and conditions of their activity, are very various from race to race. And the mortal figures that we see, and the images and idols of the temples, acquire much of their sanctity from the fact that they are expressions, or manifestations, or reminiscences of these. But of idols I shall speak in the next chapter.